All right, welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. My guest today is Cindy Aden. Welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you, Kent. Great.
Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to talk about the future of libraries. That's right, libraries in the age of Google and Amazon, in the age of the internet. This is the Something Ventured podcast, the podcast in which I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people, like Cindy, who are changing the way we view the world online and beyond. So thank you for being here. Cindy was Amazon's, Amazon.com's, are we still saying Amazon.com? Like, people know.
Yes, I think they know.
Amazon.com's first librarian, not the River's first librarian, was the head of the Washington Library Association, that's the state of Washington, and currently works at one of the largest library cooperatives in the world. Is that right?
I think it is the largest library cooperative in the world.
Perfect. So, as I was kind of preparing for this podcast, I was thinking it's going to be pretty hard to make libraries interesting.
Oh.
And as I did this, as I prepared, I kind of walked away going, it's going to be pretty hard for this not to be interesting. It's a pretty fascinating topic. And you know what else is interesting? I've done 12 of these podcasts. I have someone else scheduled. You're not the only librarian I have scheduled.
Oh, good.
I have another woman who is a librarian, went to University of Illinois, and she was actually a punk. Which seems like an odd thing for a librarian because, of course, I'm sure it's unfair, but the unfair movie cliche of librarians is,
Right. A
Mary,
little more buttoned down. But, of course,
Mary
that's a very old stereotype.
I know. And I should mention we are on the eve of the ALA, that's the American Library Association convention, which is 70,000 people. Is that right? 50,000?
The membership is about 70,000,
okay.
And there have been conventions that have had as many as 20,000 people show up. I don't know what the projected attendance is for this one.
Well, the first thing that's shocking is that there's that many librarians in the country.
Oh, yeah.
70,000 seems like a lot of people. And the second thing is, where do they get? Vegas? Like a bunch of librarians going to Vegas. Sounds like a movie. What goes on?
I know. I don't think we've ever been in Las Vegas before, so I don't know what the American Library Association, what caused it to make this selection. But they have to pick like 5 years in advance and lay out all the cities.
Yeah.
There are not that many places that can really accommodate such a big group.
Mm-hmm.
We've been in Atlanta. We go to Chicago regularly because that's where the American Library Association is located.
Easy to get to, too, of course.
That's right in the center of the country. But we're always going to places off season. Right. So you go to Philadelphia in January.
Yeah.
The only real you go to New Orleans in June.
Right.
But the only real exception to that is San Antonio, Texas. We go to San Antonio, Texas in February, and it's wonderful usually.
And what is a group of librarians getting together like?
Well, it's funny you said earlier, you were surprised to think about a punk librarian. Well, I think there really has been quite a movement. Librarians are, somewhat disruptive and rebellious. Because they want everything to be free. They believe in serving all people from all walks of life. Sometimes they are advocates for people who don't have a voice, like little children and older people who are trapped at home. So there's definitely always been a real sense of advocacy, sticking up for people, caring about causes like open access.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense. My friend who is former punk now, but a real punk back in the day is now... She has very specific ideas about information, how information should be structured, how information should be shared. She's actually working on some project, like an archival project to archive West Coast punk, actually.
Oh, that's very cool.
It'll be an all-librarian podcast. So what is the path to ending up as a librarian? Like, how does that all work?
That's a great question. When I was in graduate school, because it is a master's degree, I was...
That's right. You don't... At undergrad, there's no concept of that.
That's right.
That's really interesting.
And the graduate program has changed in that there were schools who had graduate programs who stepped away from it.
Right.
And I think they decided that it was too much of a vocational school. But other schools have persisted or else changed the focus somewhat, gone into information science, thought about it a little bit more broadly.
Yeah.
Berkeley did that. UCLA did that.
Sure.
I think Columbia closed its program, but
Really?
It was really big on preservation, which is, a very specific science within librarianship.
Right.
is how to keep paper from deteriorating. And then that gets into all the issues of digitization. So how do we digitize? How do we find the money for it? What do we digitize?
Right.
How do we make sure that access is there?
Right.
So there are lots of things that people could care about that could lead them to librarianship.
Yeah. Right.
Storytelling.
Does it have anything to do, I mean, those things, does it have anything to do with being a reader? Is that part of it? Or is it, no, I just kind of like the whole thing, like the technology, the books, the buildings, the architecture? No.
I bet that is the common thread.
That they're big readers early.
That librarians are probably all people who, when they were younger, loved books and loved ideas.
Right.
I bet that is still the common thread.
So so you were in grad school already to be a librarian, or became a librarian?
When I did my undergraduate degree, I studied international relations at Stanford, and I really wanted to go to the State Department.
Really?
Had a terrible interview. I passed the first test, and then you have an in-person all-day interview. And I was young enough to just think, well, that's the way it goes. It was probably not really smart of me to bring up Chile and Allende, and because the guy really got upset about it.
I think the CIA was what you were looking for.
Well, they asked me something about what aspect of American policy could you comment on, and at any rate, it was a surprising interview because some of the interviewers kind of broke ranks and lost their temper, and it was very odd.
Wow.
Years and years later, just after I gave birth to my first son, I got a letter in the mail from the State Department saying, if you want to be put on a list, you just won a class action suit, and we'll send you to Ghana or something.
That's really...
So it was as bad an interview as I thought it was.
So how do you get under the skin of the State Department like that?
Well, I think he was a little bit... It's probably grueling. You go around the country and you do these rounds of interviews and you're trying to find appropriate candidates. And you probably want people who are more mature, maybe...
Sure.
I was young and rebellious. I just spent 4 years living with Chicanos at Stanford thinking about...
yeah, of course, right.
learning other languages and thinking broadly about the world.
Yeah.
So... But that was a theme about librarianship. So you asked how I got into librarianship.
Yeah.
So I was on work study, and I worked in the library.
Yeah.
And the people I worked with were amazing. And librarians are very cool people. They tend to be broad thinkers.
Yeah.
They tend to have lots of interests.
Right.
This was a really interesting group of people who were at Stanford. They included me, which was really lovely. I worked there all 4 years. I was doing something.
Yeah.
So I got to know them, and I thought, wow, if I'm going to go through life with a group of people, I think I want to, hang out with librarians.
Yeah. And what were they? So, say this is before the internet.
Yes, although
were they the type? Like, I mean, there's some concept that before the not to push the analogy, but before the internet, if you went to find information, you were probably at something like a library.
Right. Right.
So I would think that the data nerds and the information nerds and the people who are interested in that would be, I would think, at the libraries before the thing happened with the internet.
Well, there was so much, even pre-web, librarians are thinking about how to make all of this information available, but they have to memorize and learn a lot more about what's out there. So those really incredible librarians from the past, you would come up to them with a question, and they could think about the print bibliography that would help you out and the 5 reference books. And drag you around the room. And
I remember the phone thing when I was a kid. The New York Library had this. You can call them up and ask them something.
That's right.
Hey, how does this work? And they'd tell you.
That's right. You could get questions answered over the phone. That's right.
That is just crazy.
Well, what's funny about that is that there are always problems with that. There have been historically certain problems with that service because there are always some unusual patrons. Like we had a stay-at-home woman. I think she had agoraphobia. She wouldn't leave the house.
Right, yeah, sure.
A really smart woman who would call us 20 times a day.
Oh, right.
With random and difficult questions.
Just lonely wanted to talk to somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Which is, unfortunately, libraries have evolved to that still today, where they've become places that people go for shelter, for air conditioning's always been the thing, but
Right. Well, and that's, I think, a problem with the way that the city offers its services. That library is open, and also it's got something for people to do. They can read magazines, they can go online, they can check their email.
Right.
And it doesn't judge, and it doesn't have any restrictions, and no one asks you any questions.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is the San Francisco Public Library, right?
Yeah, well, any big public library I can think of, but yes, I know San Francisco Public has its issues with, well, I don't know if they're issues, but they certainly have a lot of homeless.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly not what they're tasked to do, and they end up doing it anyway, because I imagine librarians are fairly, what's the right word? Oh, people who want to help other people.
Right.
At some
That's
point,
right.
so they're not.
That's right. And I wouldn't necessarily say that the profession as a whole would view homeless as a problem. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to look at what's happening. And I think there's some librarians who would say, we're serving a really important public service because actually those homeless people are looking for jobs or they're communicating with their families via email or, we are providing a needed service, but gosh, wouldn't it be great if the city would provide a hygiene station so they wouldn't shower in the bathroom or, wash in the sinks.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's interesting too, I talk in this podcast sometimes about the physicality of the city because, of course, anyone in the world can listen to it. Not everyone in the world understands how this all works in San Francisco. But the physical layout is that Twitter has a huge building right on Market Street, and about a block away, and homeless people are not welcome at Twitter, by the way, and about a block away is our public library, which is also right in an area where there's high homelessness, where a lot of homeless services are, and so a lot of them end up in the library. But
Right.
But in any case, so the path from Stanford to becoming a librarian.
Okay. So I loved those. My early colleagues appreciated them very much. Was really interested in journalism and went into journalism in Palo Alto. Worked for the first issue of the Palo Alto Weekly. Covered education on my bicycle. I think about that. Yeah. Riding my little 2-speed bicycle in the night, going to the school board meetings. Yeah. Anyway. And then moved up to Seattle and pursued journalism. Right. But the problem with journalism, when I was running my third little newspaper and I was, up late and working all weekend and not only taking all the photographs, but laying the paper out every weekend, I thought, this is not a great profession for a single woman who maybe wants to have a little bit more of a life. Right. So I started to think about what else I wanted to do, and I returned to the idea of librarianship. Yeah. And happily, the University of Washington has a program.
Really?
So I got into graduate school there, and that's where I did my degree.
And then where do you go with the library degree? Do you go to a library?
Well, one of the great things about it as a degree is that librarians are very well networked. The profession is clearly laid out, delineated. You get a degree, you get a certificate from the state. You can use that anywhere in the country. The American Library Association is a big, all-encompassing professional organization. It includes school librarians, university librarians, and everything in between. So you have a way of connecting to the profession, and you have a way of looking for jobs. You can go to the conference and go to the career center. Yeah. So it's a lot easier. Right. Once you're in, you're in.
Right. So did you end up at a library, or what the...
I did. Actually, while I was at the University of Washington, I was encouraged by one of my professors. Oh, right. I was trying to think, who was that professor? It was a guy named Joe Ford, who himself had worked at Library of Congress as an intern. And
really?
He approached me and said, there is this program, you apply, the Library of Congress takes people from all over the country. They want people right out of library school. Yeah. You should apply. And so I did, and it was an incredible experience. Was flown back to Washington, D.C. for this 2-day interview with a bunch of other candidates, and then they selected us. Really? And I was selected. So.
And what do you do with the Library of Congress?
They were, at the time, the program is now discontinued, I think, for budgetary reasons. But
surprise.
So 6 of us from around the country would be selected, and 6 people internally within the library that worked in all different departments. All 12 of us were brought together and run through this program where they would tell us pretty much how everything works. Right. And even the internal people, a lot of them, had never had that kind of exposure and understanding. And it's nice for the new people because you're with veterans, because all of the internal people had spent some time there already. Right. So you learn all about the cataloging, but you learn about all the collections that library, their collection development efforts all over the world, their offices all over the world that collect all the materials. And you learn that the library has things like, I'm just trying to think some of the most interesting things. It has Abraham Lincoln's top hat, his death mask. They took a bronze of his face and his hands.
And this is in the library?
It's in the library.
Really?
Yeah, and the contents of his wallet.
Really?
Yeah.
And what did he have in his wallet?
He had a Confederate dollar.
Right. Dry cleaning receipt, probably. Pick something up later. Wow, that is okay. So before we get to getting to Amazon or getting to the next thing, I was going to go back to kind of where libraries started, or nostalgia for library, as I called this.
Yes.
So everyone knows the famous library at Alexandria, which was after Alexander conquered whatever he conquered. He called the city Alexandria after himself. And they had a famous library. And what I realized as I was studying, I guess this library, the way they built their collection is when ships would come into the harbor. It was the big trading harbor for the whole known world, basically.
Right.
They would, whether they were borrowing or confiscating them, take the books off the ships, the scrolls at the time, but the scrolls. And while the ship was in port, they would copy the thing.
Right.
And so it was kind of like the original Napster, like the original like copyright infringement was going on the whole time. And that's how they built up this tremendous library, which was then burned down at some point later, famously, maybe
apocryphally.
Yes. Like it was burned down. We're not exactly sure who did it. For the next 1,000 years, everyone proceeds to blame everyone else for the. But interesting in that early society that was like a core of what they were doing, and that what they were doing was collecting the world's information. Obviously, there was a lot less, and it was moving on ships, but kind of doing the same thing we're doing today.
Right. It is one of the things that I think is so interesting when you think about the history of libraries is, yes, indeed, they started, you might almost say that it was more of an archival effort,
Yes.
really, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was like open to the people. I mean, I think certain people could go there, but I don't think it was designed to be like, hey, you can borrow this scroll and bring it back.
Right. Well, I don't think that there was the notion of popular literature in the same way, right?
That's right.
So
yeah.
it was not fictional mostly, although maybe there were some poems, epic
probably.
poems.
I bet.
But I bet a lot of it was nonfiction.
Yeah.
And it was history. I think that what I've heard is that there were chains so that these scrolls could be looked at, but they couldn't be removed. You couldn't go very far away. Maybe there were tables so that you could pull them onto a table.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I remember hearing in a library conference, actually, a joint Oregon-Washington Library Conference, we had a really interesting speaker who was a professor at Gonzaga University, and he said, the history, if you watch the history of libraries, it is a long fall from a great deal of control to less and less control through time.
Yeah.
And you think about the known world was probably small enough so the Library of Alexander could think it had it all, or most of it, right?
Yeah.
And it had it chained, so it would not go anywhere.
Yeah.
And then you move into libraries like the British Library and Library of Congress, closed stacks, so the scholar can come in, and usually you need a pass of some kind. You need to prove that you're worthy of being in that building.
Yeah.
And then someone will fetch the book and bring it to you, again, using it in the building. And then you move into the concept of a public library where people can walk out the door with them.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the internet comes along.
Right.
And then the librarian is no longer selecting the books, is no longer knowing what people are doing.
Right.
And can't really necessarily intervene and be giving the best advice.
Yeah.
Librarians used to really be good at recommending books, but also helping people find information.
Well, it's interesting. Before we get to the internet, in my little nostalgia for libraries, so when I was a kid, this is before the internet. Every community, every town had like three things, right? You had a fire department, which is you had a police department,
right?
And you had a library, and city hall too. But it was one of the core pieces of the community. Like maybe our parents were just using it as a babysitter in retrospect, right? They'd like drop us off at the place, but it was one of the two or three things you had in your community,
right?
You whispered when you were there. It was very church-like. It was like, do we still I haven't been in a library in a while. Like, are we still doing that, or do we what is a library like now? Do we have those still?
It's interesting you mentioned the nostalgia. That was one of the, I think that's been one of the voices, one of the themes that has been raised in the last 25 years as libraries have started to really change, as the internet has really changed libraries. Because I think a good library wants to remain relevant.
Right.
So it's always trying to take the pulse and figure out where people are and what they need.
Right.
So libraries accommodate the different communities, immigrant communities that come in. The Seattle Public Library has an unbelievable array of Southeast Asian language materials.
Really?
I was very surprised to learn. So they So they buy the materials they think people want, and then they try and figure out what really makes sense so that it remains relevant. So as children, as mothers go back to work, and children are finding their way into the library after school, or mothers are home with little kids and want something to do and bring them to story hour. They figure out ways to make homework helpers and create parts of the library where kids can talk together.
Yeah.
And tax help, that's a big thing that libraries always do.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So there's always, I think libraries are allowing food and coffee.
Really?
A lot of them have coffee stands now.
Interesting.
They're allowing, of course, unfettered internet access.
Yeah, right.
They're lending ebooks.
Yeah.
They have community halls. They have programming.
Right.
They try and be very inclusive, and they certainly aren't quiet places anymore, although there are quiet places to go.
Right. That's fascinating. So how did you get to Amazon? Like, how did that happen? Like, where?
Well, so when I was in graduate school, my professor, a woman named Dr. Raya Fidel, who was trained as a physicist, was an information scientist, and she had a really interesting project. She had a grant from the National Science Foundation under the rubric of artificial intelligence, and what she was trying to do was figure out how to create an artificial, or what am I trying to say, an automatic rubric, a way of really nailing down the thought process of searching online.
Mm-hmm.
And she had this idea of operational choices that people make to try and narrow the size of a set or get to the information they want, or conceptual ways. So she had this interesting idea. I took a class from her, loved the class, and she invited me to be her student.
Right.
And so working with her, I had all of this unusual experience, because I was really doing this. I was working on this grant, watching librarians search online. So I was early to the notion of searching online and discover what we now call discovery.
Yeah.
I was very early to that and really took to it.
Yeah.
So when I got out of school and did the Library of Congress thing, I then got a job at the University of Washington, went back to Washington after a couple of years in Washington, D.C. And there, University of Washington embarked on a really unusual project, and it used an X term, which at the time, could accommodate a really graphical display, but didn't really have any brains of its own.
Right.
And the computing science department wanted to do something with X terms, and they thought it'd be cool if the library were graphical, the catalog.
Interesting.
And we had to figure out how to get the catalog broken down and deconstructed and represented.
Interesting.
So that work was also on my resume when a friend of mine who was at Amazon, a friend from my newspaper days, sent my resume in, and they called me.
Really? So geography is destiny, right? You're in Seattle, Amazon's in Seattle, you're starting to move around on the internet, Amazon has some ideas about this. What does a librarian do at Amazon?
They want, in the interest of fairness, it should be stated that I've always been called the first librarian, but there was another woman who had already been hired, but she was fresh out of library school and went right into customer service.
Okay, yeah.
And so she was the first one, and she went on to have a really interesting career.
Right.
In fact, I got to hire her into my group. But I was the first person who had a real career and an established track record as a librarian that Amazon hired.
That's amazing.
And what we were doing was trying to look at all the data that Amazon was getting and figure out how to make it work for us.
Right.
And that was a really hard problem because data back in those days was incomplete.
Right.
No one thought that the data they used to control their inventory was going to show up online and describe the object.
And it did.
And it was forced to. That's all the data there was in the world, right? And so, fixed fields of 30 characters to describe a title or an author was all an inventory manager needed. But it's not what you need when you're online.
Right.
So there was a huge disconnect between the quality of the data and what Amazon needed.
Right.
No one had ever asked the book industry for that data.
So this is the world-famous metadata, right?
The
data
world-famous metadata.
About a book. It's not the book, it's about the book.
That's right.
So Amazon had to get that in, and that was your job, or organize it and get it and present it to people.
Right. And it was my job to look at the data we were given and try and derive the things we needed. For example, how can we figure out what this book is about?
Right.
By looking at the metadata they give us. And how can we get them to give us better and more metadata?
Right.
So I had I built relationships.
Yep.
I became part of a big working committee that produced a really big data standard called Onyx, which
Yep.
is still in use today in the publishing industry.
Yeah, right.
And as Amazon moved on from books to music, oh my gosh, the music project had its own big challenges.
Right.
Books to music to video, and then we went on to conquer, other countries.
Of course, yeah.
And then suddenly we were into like toys. Now, toy metadata
Right.
is horrendous.
Oh, I'm sure.
So they use
'Cause
the
they're
same SKU. They use the same unique identifier for a whole group of
Right.
objects, like a Star Wars figurine, when there are 5 different figurines
Right.
and it matters.
Right.
So
Right.
those are the kinds of issues
Yeah.
I was dealing with.
Well, they say that I've heard this, that the reason that Amazon nailed books so well and that Apple iTunes nailed music so well is that Steve Jobs liked to listen to music and Jeff Bezos is a big reader, essentially. I don't know
interesting.
if that's true, but it sounds roughly true.
Well, he was very persistent. I mean, there were some real challenges to it.
Yeah.
But what Amazon did, which really was groundbreaking at the time,
Yeah.
was they hired people who knew about books by genres, editors. They had all these editors who were combing the selections and curating, if you will, coming
Right.
up with recommendations.
Right.
But sometimes what those editors would do is look back through a backlist or a midlist over to a book that had been overlooked. So they suddenly brought a book forward that wasn't a new bestseller,
Right.
but that they really recommended. And there was an internal contest that they would do. I'm trying to think when this was. This would have been like June of 1998.
Right.
And they would, I'm trying to remember what they called it. I think they called it Make a Book and they would have a contest to see who could most quickly make a book a bestseller. And it would take just days
Really?
for a book that no one had looked at
Yeah.
to hit 1 million copies.
That's amazing.
They had incredible influence back then.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so the publishers were grateful for this
Right.
kind of exposure and, someone that really loved books that was catching people's attention like this.
Yeah. That's a trick, of course, right? Like you see that in journalism now where the journalists kind of like, they understand that the aggregators of journalism
Right.
are benefiting by using their content and commenting on an article, and that can't go on forever because,
Right.
of course, the virus would eat the host eventually. But I mean, somebody's got to write the source material. But they get very excited when they get 100,000 people viewing their article as well. So I'm sure the
Right.
publishers are like, these guys are screwing us over here, but we just sold
Right.
a lot of copies of something we'd given up for dead, basically.
Right. Well, and in the early days, Amazon didn't have the clout it has today. It was
Yeah.
still making its way and figuring out its strategy.
Yeah.
So it was a nice alternative to the bookstores because the big, in the olden days, Barnes and Noble ruled.
Yeah.
And it was driving small independent bookstores out of business, and it was the monster back then.
Yeah.
And it was charging publishers for placement on the shelves, just as grocery stores do. So publishers were paying
Yeah.
for placement, and
Yeah.
so
Well, and the number, I forget I know these numbers, but it's something along the lines of like the biggest bookstore has 100,000 titles in it or something like that.
boy, I don't know that number.
It's something like whatever it is, 50,000, 100,000, whereas Amazon has like 4 million, like just the amount of titles they can have compared
Right.
to your
Right.
biggest bookstore is just like,
Well, and think about, when you're in a physical bookstore trying to figure out, what you want to read next. At Amazon, you can decide you want history or biography and stumble on the same book twice.
yeah, exactly.
But with, in a bookstore, you'll have to go to one shelf or the other, and you may
Right.
not find it unless you look in both.
Yeah.
So that,
So what's it like working at Amazon? Like that can't be that. That can't be that. It's notoriously not a fun place to work.
It's funny how memory softens.
Yeah, that
There
was
were
great.
some really long nights. I had 2 small children, and I was one
Right.
of the few people in the company with children.
Right.
So it was tough, and there was a huge steep learning curve.
Right.
But I will say that it's kind of amazing to be working for a company that's in the news every single day.
Right.
You do
Yeah.
feel like you're changing the world.
Yeah.
And in the early days, particularly, you knew you were helping publishers and authors.
Right.
So it was exciting. It was exhausting. It was a
Right.
little scary.
Yeah.
And amazing people went through those doors.
Yeah,
People that I'm
exactly.
still in touch with today. So that part was great.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have tried to write about it, and they haven't all been kind. And Mike Daisy going around doing his very funny little skits about it.
Right.
You know, it's almost like therapy. You know, it's such a...
Well, anything that I've read about it seems to be that Jeff Bezos is clearly successful and has built a successful company, but that if you are there working at it, it's just a difficult environment. Like some environments are, Google, like you have all kinds of perks and you get to, spend 20% of your time, they say, doing whatever the heck you want, your own projects. Like, whereas Amazon's very much like, if you want to go work at a unsuccessful company, you're welcome to leave. Kind of like that kind of tone from the guy, which I don't take as I bet he does not find very disparaging. He's kind of like, I succeeded and it's great.
You know what I think is interesting is there is such a difference of opinion about retaining employees.
Right.
Whether you want to make a great environment for people and really have them stay, and whether you want to whether you think it's valuable to your company to keep turnover low.
Yeah.
Or whether you don't think that's important.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't think it's important because other things are more important, like always having new ideas, always have the most competitive edge. Mm-hmm. Keep this environment where everyone's a little hungry and working harder. It was certainly Amazon had a lot on its plate. Jeff really had this vision, and it was an extremely aggressive one. Mm-hmm. The markets were always both lauding the company and beating it up about not making any profit and how long can it go on doing this. Yeah. So I think it was...
Turns out a long time.
It turns out a long time.
Like a really long time.
So it wasn't taking care of its employees to the extent that probably Google makes a big deal about, was not an early idea of Amazon's. It got a lot better when it moved to new headquarters and the workspace got more pleasant. Famous stories about all of us crowded into tiny, tiny meeting rooms, meeting on the streets, meeting at the coffee shop across the street, whiteboards going up in the hallways so we'd have some place to meet.
Yeah, I heard a crazy story. It was like one of the NPR podcasts about what it was like to work in the warehouse.
Oh.
And it was some woman who was a really good writer.
Right.
Who clearly was not a fit for working in there. Because she said some people loved working in the warehouse.
Right.
But she was talking about like trying to keep up with like grabbing 170 items an hour. It was I couldn't tell it nearly as well as she did. But it was a very funny.
Well, and we all had to work in the warehouse in the winter, and those warehouses were freezing in the hard cement floors, and you're doing the 2 to 6 a.m. shift. Ugh. And you don't have a choice. Every person is going to turn up at the warehouse, even if you're a manager.
Do you think he ever regrets doing like compared to Google or Facebook, like they don't have to move anything or ship anything or have anything returned? Do you think he ever goes, oh man, I should have done one of those? Like, does he really want to ship, garden shears? I mean,
well, that's a really good question. I know that he really wanted to be the Walmart.
Yeah.
He really had this notion that he wanted people to come to Amazon and find everything they wanted. So he must have, of course, accepted that it was going to involve warehouses and, logistical problems.
Yeah.
And he has some incredibly smart people working on the logistical end.
Yeah, of course.
I think you've met one of them, actually.
We know it's Russ Al Gore.
Russ Al Gore, that's right.
And it's a bunch of guys who went to Princeton.
That's right.
And were like math and ops guys.
Yeah.
And kind of came in, as I understand it, just kind of from scratch, said, I don't know how they do it at Walmart, but, we can kind of figure this out, and we know math, and they kind of figured something out, basically.
Right.
And have now become enormously influential people at the company, as I understand it.
One of the things that Amazon did early and well is it knew that its whole business was going to be based on metrics.
Yeah.
That everything it built, it was going to have the reporting on the other end available to it. So in the really early days, the head of... what was his title? I don't know what anyone's title was back then when we were all crammed in one building, but there was a fabulous man who worked there. I got to work for him for a while. And I think he was the head of technology.
Right.
So every night he would actually look at those search logs to see what, and actually he taught me how to do that so that you could see how the metadata was working, basically. What were people looking for?
Right.
When the searches failed, what was happening?
Right.
We better figure out the 8 million different ways to spell Gaddafi's name because no one knows how to spell it. But, because in early days we didn't have autocorrect or any of that stuff.
Right.
And how many books did we sell and how many times did someone ask for this? Listen to me, I'm falling back into it.
That's all right, yeah.
Amazon always counted everything it did.
Right.
And as a result of that, it could figure out those logistical issues.
Yeah.
And think about, you're right, it was a lot of math problems,
Yeah.
around the delivery and what's going to cost the most and what is actually the cost per item.
Yeah.
They really have been very disciplined about that. And I think that's part of their success.
Well, and it's at the point now, I have a Kindle now, which is their device that lets you just download a book. And I think of a book or somebody recommends a book to me, and a process that used to involve trying to remember the book, maybe going to a library, maybe going to a bookstore, maybe ordering it from Amazon and having it delivered, now is it's on my device now.
Right.
Like now. And if I'm in Argentina or San Francisco or in Tokyo, it's on my device. It seems
brilliant.
it seems brilliant. And I don't know if this is working for the publishers, but it has definitely increased the amount I read.
Right.
Like it is definitely, I get bored with a book, or the amount of books I purchase, I should say. I get bored with a book, I just don't finish it. Like I get another one. I don't have the weight of it sitting on my desk. Like, I have to read that book.
Right.
But given all that, so what happens now for libraries? It seems like they've had these two sort of twin things happen. One being Amazon, which I guess maybe replaces bookstores more than libraries, but certainly just opens me up to being able to get anything I want. I have to pay for that. So there's the economic thing. And then, of course, Google, where information that I used to get on a research basis from the encyclopedias and from the books, where I'd look at an index and find out what this means, is all on the internet. How has that changed how we think, how we actually use libraries and actually need libraries? What do librarians think about all that?
There's been, as you can imagine, reams of literature written about all this as the whole thing started to evolve.
Yeah.
And some hand-wringing on the part of some saying, oh my gosh, we're not going to be relevant. People don't understand that not all information is created equal. And, there's a very famous, among librarians, public service librarians, there's this very famous notion of the reference question. How you get at what someone really wants. Right. And they start to say, do you have any books on American history? And you say, what is it? Are you looking for Civil War or what aspect of it? Anyway, you start down a path of really getting to what they actually want.
Right.
And I think when people are serving themselves, you worry that they're not going to get to that answer, or they're going to be happy with good enough when there's much better information out there.
Yeah.
And with the personalization of information, all of the blogs and the ways that your own cookies can control the information that you actually find and look at, there's a lot of concern amongst a lot of intellectuals, but certainly the librarian community, that people are not going to ever see the big picture. Right. They're going to limit themselves and narrow their view or not get the best information. Yeah. And so I think that the ways that, and so that was all, I'm saying all this, and this has been in the literature over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So going forward, I think instruction is a huge part of what libraries do. Of course, school libraries and academic libraries.
Sure.
Of course.
Yeah.
And more, a library on an academic campus is involved in the instruction.
Right.
And there's this notion of information literacy. Let's teach a student what good information looks like. Right. So that's certainly one of the ways that librarians have continued to develop their significance and importance in the process. Is to think about that.
Yeah, there's a concept of this has been written about a few times. The internet changes the way that people read. Meaning that even some lifelong readers and writers kind of say, I'm less inclined to sit down and read a book chapter after chapter in sequence. Because, the internet's there, and I want to look that up and check that out. And and maybe that matters and maybe it doesn't. Like maybe we're just not going to do that anymore, where we sit down and read long books because we don't have something else to do. But that's one of the concepts is that you don't read a book the way you used to. Right.
And I think that's what that Nicholas Carr book, The Shallows, is trying to talk about. Right. Amongst other things, he's talking about how the internet is actually truly affecting us. Yeah. And certainly a shorter attention span, and a very scattered attention span, allowing yourself to be distracted. Yeah. The fragmented way that we take in information, which really impacts retention, right? And it does, I think, also impact how you put things together. You probably are inadvertently getting a different view of the world than a long, slow view.
Right.
You know, the notion of sitting on a front porch and watching everyone in your town go by in the course of a day and listening to all the gossip in the general store. What a different world.
Right.
From a very selected and pointed, kind of search for just the information you think you want.
Yeah. Well, libraries always had a pace to them where you'd kind of, if you were doing research, you'd go get a couple books, like a pile of books.
Right.
And you like bring them back to your table or cubicle or whatever. And you kind of get through them and then they get cleaned up somehow. And
right.
I mean, it was a much different pace of how you'd sort of work through that stuff than what you have today.
Right. Right.
So you think libraries are going to be okay? Is that the...
librarians are nothing if not resourceful and passionate.
Yeah.
And I think
they can certainly all get jobs. Like they'll be fine.
Right?
Go to Google, go to anywhere, basically, if you know how to deal with information.
That's right. Well, a good librarian is good with dealing with information. You know, the skill set of the cataloging librarian can manage all that data stuff. The public service librarian could do public service in a huge number of settings.
Right.
And, of course, librarians are sometimes very good storytellers.
Of course.
Right? And they themselves could be publishers or writers because they know a lot about how to pull information together.
Yeah.
They would be great in the publishing industry. So you're right. It's a very useful skill set.
Yeah. But what about the physicality of the thing, or the thing that when you say library, most people think of a place that you go to that has some books and some things that go on there. It's sort of our age of whatever, we have budget cuts for anything that's closely related to the arts, literature. Like, do those survive? Do those become something different? Like some of these spaces, I forget, I'll probably say the wrong one. Something in Washington, I think, has taken many of the books out. I mean, they didn't destroy them out there, just somewhere else. And they've created a big open space for whatever that opens, which used to be there to house books, basically. Right. Like, what happens to those? And those are the grand spaces. And of course, there's every town in the country that has has that place, that brick building that has, books in it. Like, what happens to those?
Well, I believe that the physical space in general in our lives is going to continue to be important and maybe even come back into importance. It almost feels like there's been this pendulum stream where people are happy. The world got more and more virtual and people have started to spend so much of their time alone online, right? Communicating, being social, doing their research, but sitting alone in front of a laptop. Yeah. And there's been a great deal made of that and how it's not healthy and there's more depression and people need to be social and communal. The economics of the world is driving people into this notion of creating communities to solve certain kinds of problems. Mm-hmm. So it feels to me like the notion of a physical space that has a real community purpose, and a library staff that's very receptive to a lot of different uses of it will continue to be relevant. But I would say libraries will survive if they have cities and counties who want them to survive, that are willing to be creative about how to continue to be relevant, right? Supporting small businesses. I've already mentioned migrant populations, language classes, latchkey children programs, delivering books to the elderly. There are millions of ways.
That's what we always had. It was always a latchkey. People don't have latchkey kids anymore, do they?
Oh, I think so. I think there's still latchkey kids.
Yeah, no, we used to just be like, all right, when you get home, like, go entertain yourself for 4 hours till we get back from work.
Right. So libraries continue to be relevant. It is interesting. We just, my institution, OCLC, which is the largest global cooperative in the world, has just, I think today actually, it released a study that it just did, a big survey about public libraries.
Oh, really?
And one of the observations of our VP of marketing and sales, who oversaw the production of this, was that she felt one of the measures, and I haven't seen the report yet, it really literally just came out. She felt one of the measures indicated that the nostalgia factor of libraries was on the wane, slightly. Gotcha. It wasn't a huge shift. And I haven't yet asked her what that means, why she thinks that's true. Right. Because it would be my sense that in a lot of communities, the library still has quite a strong place in people's hearts.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I read, reading some surveys, people's positive feelings about libraries are enormously high. Now, whether that means they want to pay for them and that kind of thing, who knows? But it appears to be. And I imagine they're relatively not very expensive compared to other, which is always, well, maybe they are, but compared to other, the arts always seem to be, not that it's in the arts, but always seem to be much less expensive than everything else. But when you're cutting things, library's an easy one to go after.
Librarians have spent a lot of time, trying to make the argument about why they are essential to a community, what the value return is.
Yeah.
And, they are expensive because they're a physical building.
That's right, yeah.
Right? They're
that operates and they open.
And they have physical materials that they buy, and then they have a lot of online databases they subscribe to.
Yeah.
There's been quite a history of publishers who take advantage, I would say, of libraries. Their costs, their rate of rise is higher than inflation. And
interesting,
publishing is very, very expensive too, but it's pretty hard to watch, academic journals really skyrocket in price.
Yeah.
So there have been a lot of tensions and a lot of demands on library budgets.
So why don't we finish up with Google?
Okay.
Or we can finish it wherever you want. I'm just I will suggest Google. Because Google seems to be the guys who are most trying to obviate library. They're scanning things, organizing all the world's information, and making it interesting. When you hear their executives talk, they mention that much of the world's information is obviously in books, and they want to get it out. What's the relationship between librarians and Google? Is that
In the early days, libraries were very excited about Google.
Yep.
Partly because one of the things libraries want is to remain relevant.
Yeah.
They want people to come by and find them and remember that you can take you can rent a movie, you can get an ebook, you can find a story or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So the fact that Google wanted to scan all these books and talk about the fact that they were gotten from libraries meant that in some ways libraries were still viewed as important. For one thing, they had all these assets.
Sure.
And also digitization is very expensive and is really important because paper deteriorates.
Yep.
And also if a book's in a library in a particular city, not everyone can look at it.
Right.
So I think in the early days, libraries were very excited about that Google project. They saw it as a way to get their collection out there. It was an honor to have a collection worthy and unique enough to be considered.
Right.
It was exciting to be part of this, this company that was bigger than any company anyone had ever heard of, and was innovative and had scads of money.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of willingness to be part of the Google project.
Right.
I think there's still things about Google that libraries appreciate. One of the things they do is on every Google Books page, there is a Find in a Library link.
That's right. Yeah.
Have you seen that? Even though they also send you to ways to buy the book, you can, and you're sent back to my company's website.
That's right.
My
Find
institution's website. Yeah. WorldCat, which is a big global database.
Yeah.
And that's a great service.
Right.
It reminds people that libraries are out there when they're looking for a book. They say, oh, that's right. I could see if I could find it in the library.
Yeah, not right. And not pay for it.
And Google has raised the awareness and the need for good data.
Right.
There's been a lot of positive stuff that has come out of the relationship. You're right to point out that in a way it looks like they're trying to replace anyone having to leave their desk, period.
Right. They certainly say the right thing. Like when they're interviewed, they say it very respectfully.
Right.
But then again, they would until they have all the books.
Which now, they're not going to ever probably get all of the books.
And why why wouldn't they?
Well, I think that the rate of scanning has slowed. They lost a little steam when they ran into trouble with copyright.
Right, the copyright problems.
And even as the copyright problem gets resolved, it's a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
By various estimates, there are anywhere from 200 to 1 million books that are orphan works that don't have an established copyright. The copyright is uncertain.
Right, so they can't
determined.
do anything with it.
Well, it's a high risk to do something with it, right?
Right.
So I think that slowed them down, looking at that problem.
Yeah.
And, maybe there'll be some very innovative solutions that have to come out of all this, because I think people would agree that the best thing to do with all of these books is to digitize them so that they're preserved so that the access is broad. And there still will be reasons to come to libraries.
Right.
And many of those reasons maybe are more communally driven. I talked about how, there's been this swing, I think, from the isolation of working virtually to the need for community, finding like-minded people.
Yeah.
I think there's still a real place for a building that is about information and solving information problems and sharing information.
Yeah.
I think there's a real place for
And
that
we know
still.
Google's not going to do that.
Not in the same way. They do have these, I'm not going to use the right term, they have these kind of like chat room experiences and these virtual communities that they've created. And isn't Google I/O going on right now as we speak?
Right as we speak.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways that, people engage with Google and try and make the world a more interesting and provocative place.
Yeah.
So the library starts to look pretty quaint, if you're not aware of everything libraries are doing to keep up.
Well, here we are. I guess on the eve of the ALA.
Yes,
the American Library Association convention in none other than Las Vegas.
Yes,
it seems that Google and Amazon have not yet sort of signed the death warrant for libraries, and they're going to be around for a while.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Thank you so much. Hey, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much,
This
Kent.
has been the Something Venture podcast, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks.